best way that I want to start this is I found your work when I was at a time where I was having experiences with the Neteru, but I didn't have any language to put to it. So I was reading your book and Normandy's book and Nikki's book, and they really helped me understand, more about the mythologies and what was actually happening internally. But when I first started connecting with them, I was having visions of Anubis. And obviously, when you have that and you have no reference point, that can be really disconcerting. And I didn't really see the relevance that it held for me today. I could see him as I could Google him online and see that he was like God of the dead from the past. And that wasn't my experience with him in those moments. So your work really helped me with that. So first, I just want to say thank you for that. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself a bit, maybe the title of your book. And then I think you said before you also do counseling. Is that right?
I do. Yeah. Yes, I am Ruby Falconer. The name of the book that you're talking about is Shamanic Egyptian Astrology, Your Planetary Guide to the Gods. The secondary title was not my choice, so I have difficulty remembering it. It's published by Bear and Company. Um, I am primarily an astrologer. I've been an astrologer for 50 years. This next year is going to be 51. That's a long time. I started studying astrology in 1973 when I was 23 years old. So I've just let y'all know how old I am. I began doing charts professionally for other people in 1977.
Mhm.
So I've been at this a long time, a much different world then. This was pre-computer. You had to draw the charts up by hand, which I still know how to do.
Mm.
So the Egyptian, and it's interesting to me to hear the Egyptian Neteru came into my life really when I was in junior high. Really, I sometimes forget about that, but back in those days in the United States, you didn't go to summer school unless you failed something, in your regular term. I didn't, but they were doing a summer school class on the Egyptian culture. And for some reason that piqued my interest. And so I took the class and I went anyway. And, it wasn't totally satisfactory because it was a lot about the history of Egypt and the archaeology and all that, and not as much about the Neteru. But that is when I became interested. But they came into my life in a big way, probably about 30 years ago now, when I was working with my first shamanic teacher. And it was time for me to leave my partner of 25 years. And I didn't know how to do that. And I was very enmeshed with him. And my teacher at the time introduced me to Sekhmet. And I worked with her quite intensely for probably a year. This was, you use tapes, and I created a cassette tape of a meditation that I found in a book that my teacher loaned to me. That was a prayer to Sekhmet, and I recorded it. It was about 20 minutes long, and I would listen to it every morning. And Sekhmet is an agent for change. She creates change. She cuts cords. I was very corded to this man. So it took a while. When I look back, it was probably a few years before I actually left, but things began to change at that point. So that was really my introduction. And I can say more about how the book was written, but I am interested about how long ago was it that the Neteru Anubis showed up for you? And what happened? Was it dreams? Was it meditations? How did it happen for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because it was in the same kind of way that it happened for you, not to do with leaving a partner, but it was all a very internal process. And I didn't have any understanding of Egypt or I didn't go looking for it in any way. And I remember I sat down and closed my eyes in a meditation and I was taken down these steps. I can remember it so clearly. And I was stood next to him over a body. And the body was all coated in gold. And we were working on it together. And he felt, this is going to sound so incredibly strange, but he felt like Jesus. Like he felt like the nicest energy that I'd ever experienced. And when I came back from that, um, I like I said, I Googled it online. I went online and was like Googling big black dog god. I kind of thought he was called Anubis. And everything that came up was very much in, I imagine, the history that you got taught at your summer school, the archaeological, the god of the dead, god of embalmment. And there were definite reference points. But what it didn't explain was how sensory and how real and the frequency of him that I knew. And I wonder if when you started connecting with Sekhmet, was that the sort of experience that you had? You were able to move into her as a frequency and start to know her um, in that way beyond the kind of titles that she held or what descriptions there were about her from an external point of view.
Most definitely. And in fact, I don't think I really knew what the external descriptions were.
Mm,
And I think it's important to understand it that that point I was working with a shamanic teacher. And so she was my first shamanic teacher. And by a shamanic teacher, what I mean is someone who works with earth energies,
hmm
with the when we think about shamanic peoples, these are peoples who live very much in tune with the changes of the earth. So if we go back in history, all people at one time were shamanic peoples because they traveled. The tribe would pick up and move because the caribou they know this, that every year at this time caribou would come through a particular valley. So we want to be there
mm,
because we will hunt the herd and we will get meat for the winter, and we will get hides, and we will be able to create our habitats and our clothing. And so there's a rhythm there, and we need to be over here at this time because the strawberries will be coming forth. And so everything's in a rhythm with the land in a way, of course, that a modern life doesn't have, although many people long for that and find ways to
mm,
recreate it in their life. This was how everybody lived. It's in all of our roots in some way. We all genetically come from people who lived in this natural rhythm with the land. So this was by working with this teacher. I didn't know who Sekhmet was according to the myths that
yeah.
if you go and get a book about Egyptian mythology, I didn't know who she was. It was direct experience. And that's what I think is important, is that over the last 30 years, and Izzy, I did your chart. You were born. I don't know if you remember me talking about you were born at the Uranus-Neptune conjunction,
Yeah.
which was a huge thing. It happened from about 1988, 87 through 95, 96, right in there approximately. And it only happens once every 160 years, something like that. So it's a huge, so once in a lifetime, not even that, right? And what I have come to understand this was when the harmonic convergence was happening. And I remember as an astrologer, people would ask me, well, what about the harmonic convergence? And I'd be like, I don't know. I don't see anything astrologically. It was not based on the Western zodiac. It was based on the Mayan zodiac. So, and I don't understand anything about the Mayan zodiac. So I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. But hindsight being 2020, what I do understand is that there was a huge number of changes that happened. And I kind of think of it symbolically. Uranus ripped a hole in our dimensional reality that allowed energy from other dimensions to come through. And a lot of souls came through at that time too. You're one of them,
Mm,
right? And so for me, I'm already alive, but I'm opening up to the Neteru in a very direct experience sort of way. And that's the difference. If you go and get a book out of the library about Egyptian mythology, it's going to depend on who writes it. But a lot of the books that have been around forever, the books that I would have been reading back then, or would have read when I was a child, or that were influenced the person who did that class when I was in junior high school, the information that's in there comes from Victorian England and from France from the 1800s. And it's comes from people who are basically anthropologists and archaeologists who were reading the Greek and Roman historians who were traveling through Egypt late in its history. You know, Egypt as a culture is 8,000 years old. You know, they were traveling through Egypt at the end of its independent time when it was first basically kind of a colony of Greece and then later a colony of Rome. That's about 1,000-year period from about 600 BCE to about 400 CE. So, you know, they would be, of course, as everyone does, they would be viewing the culture through their own cultural lens, which is Greece and Rome. And then they would be interpreting what they're seeing from that perspective. And so they're not really getting it. Because for one thing, it's very polarized. You know, a big piece of what goes on is there's a polarization that happens with myth globally, where there's a fragmentation between the opposites, the most obvious opposite being yin and yang, and a tendency to think one side of the pole is better than the other, you know, which is causes a lot of trouble in our culture to think one side of the pole is better than the other. And I do think that that's the point of transformation that we're at. And that's why the Neteru shows up in so many people's dreams and visions. It's like a way to wake up to who they really are. You know, when you said that your experience of Anubis, he had a kind of a Jesus sort of feeling, you're not the first person who sensed that. You know, there's this huge open heart with this being, this entity, that's very loving and very kind. You know, when you look into Anubis's eyes, you feel loved, you know, you feel like understood.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like he understands. He understands how hard it is to be on planet Earth. It's very hard to be here. He gets it. You know, he gets how painful it is. He was an abandoned child. Who on this planet has not at some time felt abandoned? And who doesn't fear it? Most of us fear abandonment. You know, it's a big issue here in this dimensional reality. So, you know, he's a very loving being, and a lot of people have associated him with Jesus.
That's so interesting to hear. I haven't heard anyone else. Actually, I think I read once that someone connected him with Christ consciousness. So it's good to hear you say
Yes.
that as well. But that's just, my mind just exploded with so many questions. So I quickly wrote one down and then I'm going to go through them so I don't forget them. But I want to go back to how you first started moving from, because I imagine you trained in Western astrology, but then you maybe
Didn't
moved.
train.
Oh, you didn't train. Interesting. Okay. Can you tell your astrology story a bit and then how it evolved to become Egyptian astrology?
Yeah, I think it's actually, you know, my introduction to astrology is relevant in a sense. So, 1973, you know, astrology was a big deal, kind of like it is now. It was very, you know, the hippies were into it, you know, all that kind of stuff. It was a big thing. Age of Aquarius, all this kind of stuff. I was a very logical person. I'm a Virgo, so I'm very logical, you know, and I considered myself to be an atheist at that point. Um, and what happened was somebody did my chart and they didn't know how to interpret it. They just knew how to draw it up. So they drew it up for me. And he kind of looks at it and he says, Moon in Scorpio, that's not a very good position for a woman. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So I got interested. And so I started, you know, I got an astrology book, Alan Oken's Complete Astrology. I still think it's one of the best astrology books for beginners. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was very good at explaining the nuts and bolts, you know, of the symbolism of astrology. So I started studying it and I learned it very quickly. And what I came to feel was it was more like remembering than learning. And I have since come to feel that, you know, I do believe in reincarnation. I believe in past lives. I believe I've had many, many, many lifetimes as an astrologer. So I was simply on many levels remembering what I already knew. I never took a class. I just did it that way. I got tons of books. I can look over at I have a bookcase that has, my books are, some of these books are 50 years old. At a certain point, I stopped reading the books because they were very confusing for me in that people would have a tendency to say, this is how it is. And I've never been that kind of person. Because I think that for me, that I've come to understand that cuts off curiosity. So I was more like, this is what you think it is. Okay, that's interesting. What do you think it is? And then I try and find my own way in that. But I don't feel like I know anything really. In fact, the older I get, the less I know. That's kind of a John Lennon concept. Anyway, um, I ended up at a certain point, I quit reading the books and I did precisely what we're talking about. I began to meditate with the symbolism itself. And it was an astrologer who he has more to do with the way we approach astrology probably than any other person. His name is Dane Rudyar. He died probably around the time you were born. But he wrote an amazing book in I believe it was 1936, called The Astrology of Personality, where he took Jungian psychology and he applied it to Western astrology. And this is the basis of modern astrology. Most people don't realize that, but it's where it comes from. He brought it into the modern age, so to speak. And I just began, he wrote a book called The Pulse of Life, where he went through the zodiac and he showed how all of the signs grow out of one another. And that became a template for me of meditating on the signs and the symbols and really letting them talk to me. Letting them talk to me. Western astrology is based on Greek and Roman myth. And so in every symbol, there is a story. So I began listening to the stories and it began to have significance for me. So if you fast forward to 2005, my co-creator and my co-author of the book and the co-creator of Shamanic Egyptian Astrology, Linda Starwolf, at the time, she still is, she's a spiritual and shamanic teacher. She runs an organization called Venus Rising. And I was working for her. I met her in California. And when she moved here to Western North Carolina, I moved here with her and some others to continue working in the organization. The organization, she began Venus Rising in 1996. But in 2005, she went to Egypt. And when she went to Egypt for the first time, she went with Nikki Scully. And of course, Nikki Scully by then was an old hand at Egypt and very much a kind of a Egyptologist. She, understood the Egyptian Neteru in a specific way that was based on her training and her direct experience. Starwolf didn't know a thing about that. She just went there and she's a channel and she just started listening to the Neteru and they started talking to her. She and Nikki would scribe. Nikki's very much influenced by Thoth. So she would scribe what Starwolf would say. It became a book called Shamanic Mysteries of Shamanic Egypt and an oracle deck, the Anubis Oracle deck, which is an amazing oracle deck. And it's a synthesis of the two of them in many ways. And so when Starwolf came back, she's, of course, talking constantly about this. And I'm listening to her and I'm kind of realizing, oh my, all right, okay. So Thoth is Mercury. Isis is Venus. I began to see, Osiris is Pluto, how there are correlations between the Neteru of ancient Egypt and the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome. And, basically the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome are the same ones, just with different names and slight variations in their stories. Rome as a civilization came to its supremacy after Greece, and Rome had a tendency to kind of, whoever they took over, they sort of adopted their gods and goddesses and incorporated them into their own pantheon. And I began to realize that there was a continuity here and that the Egyptian Neteru in many ways was like the great great grandfathers. Isis is like the great great grandmother of Venus, and Osiris is like the great great grandfather of Pluto. And the details are different, and that's important. They're different for a reason. But I began to see the connection. And so after a certain point, I talked to Starwolf about this. And so we created together Shamanic Egyptian Astrology, and we wrote the book. And because I was the astrologer pieces of it are for me. The kind of the invocations and the inspiration comes from her. And so there's a lot that can be said about that, because there's a transition, a change, and there's a reason why I find overlaying the Egyptian archetypes onto the traditional Greek and Roman archetypes adds more complexity to the astrological model. And also it takes us to a level of wholeness that is not present in traditional astrology. So
Yeah.
and so that's been kind of what I've done since that. I am an astrologer. I do chart readings for people, but I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There's a long, long history of tradition in astrology that's very useful, and I use it, but I also overlay the Egyptian archetypes because I think it gives more texture.
Mm. So when you say archetypes, that reading that and understanding that completely changed my experience with the way that I was interacting with the Neteru through, visions and dreams and meditations. Because until then, I'd only heard of archetypes in the sense of the warrior, the rebel, the lover, kind of Western archetypal language that I'd been used to. I had those archetype cards by Caroline, I think it's Caroline Myss that makes them, or MYSS. So would you be able to speak a little bit about that, the Neteru as these archetypal beings and the way they flow through each of us, or we can start to experience them within our own psyche, because that's something I found really interesting.
Yeah. I think in order for me to do that, I have to there's a perspective that I have that not everybody has, and not every
Okay.
astrologer has, and not everyone sees things. But as with many people, I've always been fascinated by the myths and stories. I was one of those kids that was always reading the Greek and Roman myths when I was a child. They were fascinating to me. I don't know why. That's why I took the Egyptian class when I was in junior high school, because these stories were fascinating. I will say that I am not as familiar with the Indian and the Chinese mythology, somewhat with the Norse. But what really fascinated me was Greek and Roman. So I was a setup for becoming an astrologer, since that's the basis, for Western astrology. What I will say is every culture around the world virtually has some version of astrology. And woven into that is the myths and stories of that culture that are ancient, that go back into time, that inform the culture. So yes, in the Western world, we have the hero, the mother, the Madonna, whatever. They have versions of those in other mythologies as well. However, what has happened for people, and it happened for me too at a certain point, is that these energies, these symbolic energies, what we're talking about when we think about the archetypes in the way that you were introduced to them, is really the psychological, it's the influence of Carl Jung, basically. The psychological concept that these energies do live within us, and at various times in our life we're going to go on a hero's journey. We're going to identify. There's a lot of psychologists who have made a living from working with these various archetypes and understanding them. The father, the king, for men, the warrior, the priest. There's different traditions or different understandings around that. And I think that's very true. You know, it's something Joseph Campbell worked a lot with, is the idea that these energies live within us. What we get when we're working with the Egyptian Neteru, and the way not just them, but because it's happened with other um, energies as well. You know, what part of my story has been working with breath work. You know, Linda Starwell through Venus Rising created a version of breath work modality called shamanic breath work. And it's not unusual, not just in that modality, holotropic breath work, any kind of process where you not just meditate, but you do a full body going in using the breath to help create an altered reality. It'll happen for people if they do plant medicines, is archetypal energies, guides, you know, whatever they might be, come forth to inform people. So the question then becomes, who are they and what are they? You know, now we have an internal process, you know, with Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. We have the idea that we all carry these beings, these aspects of self within ourselves. So there's a whole multiverse in here. We are not one-dimensional beings at all. You know, we've got all of these different parts within. But now we have them coming through in a way where, what are they? Are these beings from other dimensions? Are these beings from other planets? Maybe. I don't pretend to know. But that's a possibility. One of the things about ancient Egyptian culture, again, it's one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth. You know, in terms of how the archaeologists and the anthropologists measure civilizations, Egypt is considered to be, along with Persia, it's now Iran, to be among the oldest, Mesopotamia, that the civilization emerged about 8,000 years ago from these two areas. And it happened because people stopped being nomadic and agriculture started to happen. They started to stay put and to plant. So there's a switch that happened where they're, rather than moving with the seasons and with the energies of the earth, they discovered that they could, to some degree, manipulate nature. So both of these civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt, were along a river, and a river would flood. And then they discovered, oh, we can channel it. You know, we can create irrigation. You know, we can use that to plant our crops. You know, that's considered to be the beginnings of civilization. And so once these cultures started staying in one place, then they began to build a body of myth, you know, around these gods and goddesses that they had been, in a very shamanic way, worshiping for centuries, as, you know, having a connection to nature, right? You know, some of the gods and goddesses were more aligned with air, some with water, some with earth, some with fire. You know, they would give them a name, with stars, you know, whatever it might be. So I guess what we're talking about is are they a creation of humans, or did they already exist? And at a certain point in the development of humanity, they began to communicate with us directly. As Egypt progresses as civilization, they became quite knowledgeable about the cosmos. You know, they understood the movement of the stars. You know, they understood, you know, they would start their new year with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star Sirius, which is the brightest star in the night sky. It's relatively close. I think it's 5 light years away from us, which is pretty close, you know, in space terms. And they believed that their origins, their cosmic home, was there. You know, so part of what was built into their understanding of their role as humans, as a civilization, is that their origins were in the stars.
Mm.
So these beings that they worshipped, that they built temples to, weren't just, gods and goddesses. They were an extension of that shamanic perspective that, of a god of air, okay, or a god of water. They were an extension of that. They were an
Mm.
evolution of that. And for them, they came from other places. Thoth is considered to be a creator god. It's Mercury in Western astrology. Thoth was called the sacred scribe. He was the creator of writing, of alphabet, of language, of time. Oh my. Oh my. Just think about that for a little while. Now we've got the creator of this dimensional reality. Oh, no, that's interesting. So if we commune with those, we are communing with a being who created the very dimension through which we're viewing reality. He's creating our consensus reality. That for me is just a trip.
Yeah.
I
I
can
mean,
sit with that for a long time.
yeah, it's something that I have definitely found a bit discombobulating at times, like when I've gone through different areas of understanding, and it's like I experience it straight through myself, and my head, when I'm just doing my everyday stuff, it's like my head can't quite catch up. And something that you said then, I think really highlights the way that it feels to be so different now, to me at least. Leaders and the majority of people, I would say, don't have a higher connection or a connection with the stars or any sort of understanding that goes beyond what's outside of ourselves or what we're physically looking at. And I think to imagine a civilization where leaders and where masses of people had that connection or had that understanding, it shows to me how vastly different they were from us, and perhaps how much we have to learn from that in our reconnection to our spiritual selves or those deeper aspects of who we are. And I think that leads me on to another question that I had for you surrounding the myths and perhaps the myths as blueprints. Because when you spoke about the way that the Osiris is like the grandfather of Pluto. Was that what you said? Was that correct? Yeah.
That's right.
I had or an understanding that I have is that the myths are, and I don't know whether you'd agree with this, the myths are essentially blueprints or patterns that flow through history and flow through our psyche as well. And what you were saying about Osiris and Pluto really made me think of that. The details or the situations or the faces might be slightly different, but the underneath essence that weaves all the way through is essentially very similar or the same. And something that I noticed when I went to Egypt and when I started reading more of your work with the mythologies is how the stories of the myths play out in individuals' lives now in the same way, where the situation isn't the same, the faces, the people aren't the same, but the essence of the story is exactly the same. And I just wonder what your views on that are.
Well, that's very much why I do what I do, because I do think that the myths play out in our lives. And as an astrologer, when I look in an astrological chart, I see different emphases in particular areas. We're all different. We have similarities. And if you tie it in with the myths, you will see. I mean, I'm sitting here kind of sitting with the idea of a blueprint. Because there's two ways my mind is going right now, Izzy. On the one hand, over these 8,000 years of Western civilization, there has been a fragmentation away from a kind of wholeness that existed in the shamanic realm when humans were in harmony and in a rhythm with nature. And that even continued on, I think, in the early parts of civilization. In the early civilizations were still very informed by the natural rhythms of nature. Over time, that has broken down. And one of the things that I know you were asking about, you were wondering about, was in my introduction to the book, Shamanic Egyptian Astrology, I talk about how bringing in the Egyptian archetypes brings a much needed wholeness to astrology, which has been lost in that modern astrology or traditional astrology is very much about the wounds that we suffered not that long ago. And some astrologers still do this, which is like, I have trouble with this because it feels very fear-based. They will look at a chart or an aspect that, say somebody's having a transit from Saturn, and they'll see that as a very negative thing, because Saturn in traditional astrology is the principle of constriction. And it's like, oh, that's a bad thing. We don't want to feel constricted. We want to feel expanded. That's the opposite point. That's Jupiter. So we don't like Saturn. It was called the Great Malefic, while Jupiter was called the Great Benefic, which is kind of a deterioration around the experience of duality, where we move into polarization. One side of the pole is good and one side of the pole is bad. And that's become very much the dominant feature of modern life. And not everybody's there, but when you talk about the leaders and when you talk about the systems that we live in, this is very much there. This is good and this is bad, and we're going to go for what's good. And the only problem we have is that one person will think this is good and another person will think this is good. And so now we have conflict. It gets even worse when one country thinks this is good and that's bad, and they're in opposition, and we have war. And so we have a lot of suffering on our planet because of this polarization and this way of living with duality. What I'm aware of is that in these ancient cultures and with the Neteru, there is no bad or good, there only is. And so it becomes how we work with what is, as opposed to saying that this is bad and that's good. And there we might say, I like this and I don't like that. That's fine. But adapting to what is what's important. And there's something that gets lost along the way. So in some ways, if there's a blueprint, and this is my interpretation of it, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What's going on here? Well, it's maybe to experience this and to come to some different relationship with third dimensional reality. There's a lot of talk these days. People talk about moving into fifth dimensional reality and unity consciousness. I think a lot of that is what we could call light polarized, and misses the point in some ways. And at the other hand, coming to a kind of way in which both the dark and the light are held, and seeing the whole that is third dimensional reality, rather than, this is good and that's bad. That may be the blueprint of what we're all meant to experience and where we're meant to come out. We're not doing real well with this right now. We may not solve this puzzle, as a species, but perhaps that's the blueprint. And maybe there's a huge rush of this energy coming from other dimensional realities, coming through that Uranus-Neptune conjunction, that rent in this reality, souls like yourself coming through at this time, because you were born during that period, that we can begin to see what we've been missing, and do it differently, so, and that might be the blueprint. And a lot of people, including myself, is like, what was I thinking coming here? This is crazy. This is not an easy planet to live on, and it's getting harder all the time. What was I thinking? Why, what? But as an astrologer, I have many years, many, many years when people would bitch, and complain and play victim. I would get to the point where I would just say, hey, this is the name of the game on planet Earth. Choose a different planet next time. Yeah, this is the story here. Work with what is, as opposed to, so maybe that's the blueprint. I don't know.
That's made me
I
really
don't know if
think.
that answers it.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's like sent my brain off on so many tangents as well, thinking about um just even that concept of wholeness and polarity. Myth has taught me or evoked within me some kind of remembering of more spiritual principles or concepts than any other way of learning or teaching or understanding. And that's something which I find so fascinating about them, I think, is the way that you can read a myth, um, and know the archetypes that are the characters or the roles that are being played out within it, like Horus and Hathor. And the more you read about their interaction or their story, and you know what they are the embodiments of, the more it develops and the more the principles and the teachings start to kind of arise within. And I think that's something that I found uniquely interesting because it comes in layers. It's not like you read it and then you have the teaching and it's all there. It very much is something um, that I found that develops. So when you were reading the Egyptian myths or you started to work with the Egyptian myths, what was that something you were doing? Because I know you mentioned that you meditated on the symbols of Roman and Greek astrology, but was that something you then started to do with Egypt as well?
Well, by the time the Egyptian myths came into my life, that's how I approach pretty much everything. So yes, but let's take an obvious one. Um, so in traditional astrology, we have Venus, and Venus is the feminine principle. She is the yin, right? So if you look at who Venus was in Roman myth, she was in some ways, the epitome of what men considered feminine beauty, right? Because you see, that's an element that can't be taken out of this, is that by the time we get to the myths of Greece and Rome, there is a tremendous imbalance between the opposites,
Mm,
especially what we could call the opposites between yin and yang. And another way of saying that would be masculine and feminine. And I resist overusing those terms, because we have what I consider to be a very healthy um, change in the relationship between masculine and feminine energies, which has been going on all my life, really. Um, and part of perhaps my background, growing up as I did, coming of age as I did, coming to maturity as I did in the 60s and 70s, is an understanding that the systems that we live in are very patriarchal,
yeah.
and that they are very skewed towards yang energy. And we see that all over the place, and it still continues, that aggressive, strong, confident energy, pushy energy, anything that we could, kind of identify as yang, assertive, is considered better than receptive, introvert, even extrovert and introverted people. Many people think extroversion is a better way to be than introversion,
Mm,
which is, kind of doesn't even make any sense to me, who's very much an introvert. But it also, I think, we still see that there's been a lot of changes in my lifetime, but it's still there. We're skewed that way. So if we look at Greek and Roman myth, She was Venus to the Romans, Aphrodite to the Greeks. There's a diminution of power just between these two. Aphrodite had more power in her own right than Venus. Most of the women in Greek and Roman myth have their power through acts of revenge.
Yep. Yep.
That's
I've
where they get their
noticed
power
that.
from. They don't have power inherent in and of themselves. So if we take the antecedent of Isis, who is the antecedent of these two, she has inherent power in and of herself. This is not a revengeful being. She can act in war, but she's also supremely nurturing. Now, you could trace a way through the 8,000 years of human history where we can start out with the shamanic antecedents of Isis, who is Nut, who's part of Nut and Gab. And there are others, because one of the things about Egypt was it covered a lot of territory, and various shamanic clans would have their own gods and goddesses, of course, but they all had a mother goddess, right? And there's a wholeness about her, and then she begins to fragment. So by the time we get to the Christian myth, and without insulting anybody who's considers themselves strongly to be a Christian, we're talking about myth here. We have within the Christian mythology, we have Christ consciousness, we have God, and we have Mother Mary, the least powerful of them all, right? She is a mother, and there's a fragmentation there. We have, the Madonna, and we have the Magdalene, who is the whore. There's all kinds of ways. This is a huge topic in and of itself, but you can trace, we start with a kind of a wholeness with the origins of the Egyptian myth, and we can see even within Egypt over time, the origins of Isis, her antecedent within Egypt is Hathor, who is the Great Mother. She splits into two, Isis and Nephthys. And the way the Greek and Roman historians would see it is Isis is the good goddess, Nephthys was bad. Isis is the solar goddess, Nephthys is the lunar. She's the dark, Isis is the light. The fragmentation begins in Egypt.
Yeah.
Now that's the blueprint, Izzy. We are the receptors of all this fragmentation. When I say we, I mean everybody who's alive today, modern humanity. We are the receptors. We're on the receiving end of all this fragmentation. Our challenge as individuals is to find internal wholeness, which is in a way reclaiming that original teaching of wholeness. And I think that's why the Neteru comes through in people's meditations, their breathwork journeys, their ayahuasca journeys, whatever, and it's not always Egyptian, right? Kuan Yin may show up, or, Quetzalcoatl, or, whatever. But these archetypes show up to help us, who do we need? What medicine do you need today? Maybe you need a dose of Anubis. Maybe somebody else needs a dose of Kuan Yin, right? Or Osiris. Our job is to pay attention, to be willing to say, oh, you've got some medicine for me, some information for me. I need to listen. How many people out there are dreaming about these beings and just, oh, that was weird.
Yeah.
They're not listening.
So
that, I think, is the blueprint.
It's interesting. It's so interesting to hear you say this, Ruby. It's a thought. It's honestly thoughts that I've never had in that. The texture of the thought has changed, if that makes sense. Like the way that I was thinking about it has changed a little bit since you've said that. And I wonder, do you think that the myths of each period reflect the state of consciousness? Like they're one and the same. So
Yes,
beginning in
yes,
wholeness. Yeah.
yes,
Interesting.
yes. So by the time we get to Rome, okay, on the height of Rome was more or less, somewhere around 0 BCE, a little before, say 100 BCE, up to about 400. And of course, Rome didn't completely die then because the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived. It was the Western Roman Empire that disintegrated, was invaded by the barbarians, the Visigoths, and the others. Created the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. By the time we get there, these are very patriarchal cultures. They're very male dominated. Um, it's not that there wasn't in ancient Egypt, there definitely was assigned roles based on gender. Of course, there was. But there was a different way in viewing those roles in terms of their relative value.
Yeah.
So in the ancient world, part of what a woman would do would bear children, right? And part of what the man would do would be doing the physical work and protecting, but they were of equal value. They were not, one wasn't better than the other.
Mm.
You know, there was more of a cooperative process that has been lost, and that was reflected in myth. So Isis, who was the queen mother of heaven, in her myth, she's a sorceress, she is a magician, she is a wife who loves her husband Osiris, totally goes to the ends of the earth to find his body after he is killed by his brother Sat. She recreates his body. She raises her son Horus with love and devotion. She raises her nephew Anubis with love and devotion. And if she needs to fight a war, she will. She will. She's a negotiator. She's a powerful feminine being,
Mm.
who is uh, in her strength and is respected as she's not seen. I mean, if you think about one of her descendants is the Christian Mary.
Yeah. Can I ask a
There
question
is
about,
evolution of
sorry.
power. That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question was with you mentioned Isis and Osiris. Um, and I wonder if their myth and their story can also be taken in terms of natural law and principle. So their story is speaking about these great beings, these gods and goddesses, but can also translate or be a language to understand two pieces of natural law, which might be the yin and the yang, or the masculine and the feminine principle. Is this something that you feel the myths also do?
Yes, most definitely. And there's a difference, I believe, in how yin and yang was experienced in these cultures opposed to the way we experience it now. We can't help but understand or perceive yin as being less powerful than yang.
Mm.
I know now many of us do understand that it is equally as powerful and that the powerful manifests in a different way. But you said earlier that's not woven into, that's not how our leaders see it.
Mm.
That's not how, it's not woven into our system, into our structures. This happens for me all the time. You mentioned that I'm a counselor. This is one of the things that I do. A lot of people suffer because they're not comfortable with emotions, and they don't want to feel emotions, because to feel emotions makes them feel vulnerable, and to be vulnerable feels dangerous. And this happens all the time. People say, the idea of being vulnerable will bring them to tears because it makes them feel like a target, right? Well, feeling vulnerable is being in your yin pole, because vulnerability is the yin strength. Now that's hard for people to really wrap their minds around it. They might be able to intellectually get it, like, okay, that makes sense, but it's difficult to embody, because strength feels like you need to be assertive, you need to be aggressive. I mean, how many times have people said something like, well, I have difficulty being a human being, I'm more of a human doing?
Mm.
That's yang energy. Simply being and seeing the value in being, receiving, that's yin strength. We have lived through at least 5,000, close to 8, it began 8,000 years ago, imbalance. It began with the development of civilization, imbalance between the yin and the yang, with the yang being overempowered and the yin being progressively more and more diminished. As part of what we are attempting to bring back into balance. And a lot of has gone, this story of my life, and everyone my generation, even before I was born, we've been trying to bring these two into balance, because when I say we, I mean the collective we, because it's absolutely necessary. That we've suffered from the more putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. This is the story of the imbalance of duality. This is the story of polarization.
And with Egypt kind of working its way back, or the way that I understand it or see it, and maybe you do as well, like the more and more people are speaking about it or having these experiences, like you said, maybe this is us starting to move back to wholeness, because that's where that piece is held, or those myths are held, and those teachings are held.
I think that's why they're showing up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly. This is a place I don't know. Are the home Sirius, maybe Arcturus? But people are drawn to different stars, right? I have a strong affinity with Arcturus. If people don't go out in the night sky and look at the stars and see if anyone speaks to you, do it. It's hard to do in the cities, but the brighter stars, the first magnitude, Arcturus, Sirius, those stars, Vega, they'll frequently be visible. Go out and look at them. You'll commune with the stars. See what happens when you connect with the stars. I personally feel, and I do not know, but I believe on some level that there are beings in other dimensional realities that are interested in Earth, and that they are communing with us, and that they are trying to help us right the imbalance that is present on this planet, so that we can not just survive as a planet. And it's a little sketchy right now whether that's going to happen, but we could move to, this is what people was when they talk about ascension, which is not a word I like, because it implies moving up and down in a vertical way. And for me, this is not what this is about. This is about getting bigger. It's about expanding our awareness. It's moving out of the limitations of black and white, light and dark, good and bad, and moving, into something bigger, where we understand wholeness in a different way.
Mm.
The yin yang symbol, that, right? The Tai Chi symbol, right?
Yeah.
meditating on that. Actually, I have one right here. It sits on my desk, right?
Mm.
This symbol. Okay. So we have dark and we have light. And look at that. Then we have dark. You can't really see it here, but we have in the light, we have dark, and in the dark, we have light. Okay. So we have the opposites in one picture. And what I really understood, when this happened for me, is that when I look at these, it's not about the either or, it's about the circle that holds them all. That's where the story is. The circle that holds these opposites within it. That's where wholeness lies. Star Wolf has a saying, a mantra. It's almost like a koan that she's been saying for years. The light, the dark, no difference. And spend some time thinking about that. Not only are they not different in the sense that one's dark, one's light, they're no different. They're all part of the same experience. That's what astrology has taught me. As an astrologer, sometimes we have transits where life gets very difficult.
Mm.
One of the things people wouldn't like, they'd have a Saturn transit and suddenly everything's constrained and you can't move forward in your life. You can't accomplish the things you want. And people wouldn't like it. They feel against it. They miss the message, which is sometimes we need to go in the cave. We just went through a solstice. I no longer refer to the solstices by their seasons. For you, where you live in Australia, you just went through the summer solstice. Yes, longest day of the year. For me, where I live, we just went through the winter solstice, shortest day of the year. Very different, right? Different kinds of experiences, absolutely different. But in another way, they are both experiences of planet Earth. It's one experience. You're just on one end of the pendulum, I'm at the other. We're gonna come back and meet at the equinoxes, and then we're gonna move on. And you're gonna experience the winter solstice. I'm gonna experience the summer. It's no different. It's Earth experience. It's one experience. It's just how we see it. It's not better or worse. One person might like summer better, another person might like winter better. That's so what? It's not inherently bad or good. It's just different. Shamanic peoples understood this. People who live close to the earth, this was built into their being. We remember this in some way because that's all of our roots. Doesn't matter where our heritage lies. We have in our blood people who lived in that relationship. We have to remember that. There is no bad or good. There only is the light, the dark, no difference. It's just one experience.
Ruby, I feel like
So the only question is, what are we going to do if we, say, okay, there is no bad or good, but yeah, I don't like that as well. That's probably not so good. Murdering children is not a good thing. We should stop that. Yeah, that'll be better for everybody, wouldn't it? Does it really matter whose children they are? Does it? We need to stop killing them.
Yeah.
We need to create systems that support not killing them, as opposed to creating systems that will kill them quickly or better or more cruelly, which is where we still are.
Yeah. I think that, the shift in understanding that the dark doesn't mean evil or bad is a pretty profound one to have because, understanding even Osiris as the regeneration or the growth that can be held in the darkness, or when we move through that Saturn period and all those challenges come up and limitations and how much we can actually move through, it really changes the idea of those darker periods or the winter of being something that's, like you said, bad or evil to being just another side of the coin. And I think that, I have one final question for you, but in two minds. So I kind of want to leave it on what you just said because it was so powerful, and I felt like I was in a bit of a trance just just listening to you then. And I would definitely meditate on that symbol. That's not something, or that's not one that I've connected with before. So I'll find that very interesting. Um, but because I have you, I would like to ask you one last question if you have time. So, uh, I know I mentioned to you before that you come into my dreams quite a lot, and it's always very interesting. I always really pay attention to them. And one that I had recently was I was sat with you doing a reading for someone, and you told me to look through the person, and within them, I could see all these different strands of DNA, but within there were gold portions of DNA, not loads, but there was thin strands of golden threads running through every single person. And in my dream, you said to me, every person holds strands of divine beings within them. Now, I didn't know if this was a metaphor or even true at all, but I just wondered if you had any understanding or reflection that you would be able to give me on that dream because it really stuck with me.
Yes. I think my dream self is a lot smarter than my human self, I'll tell you that. But what I will say, what immediately I went to in my own mind was, an astrological chart where um, all of the elements, all of the planets are there, all of the zodiac is there, all of these archetypes are there. We really are, multiverse internally. And in any given lifetime, it's like there's a certain ones will come forth more. So there will be a certain kind of like this is our assignment for this particular lifetime, so to speak. This is, what we're going to work on. I've come to believe that, again, I believe in reincarnation, so that when we come to life, when we're born, I think that there are things that we're working on that are personal to us, but there's also things that are universal, that we're working on as a gift, in a sense, to give back to our human family, our earth family, our planetary family, to contribute to the transformation. So I'm just going to use you as an example. You have a lot of Capricorn in your chart. I mean, you have a lot of, I've got your chart over here. You got Venus, Mercury, Mars, Sun, and then you have that Neptune Uranus conjunction. It's in Capricorn. So, but just having Venus, the principle, the feminine principle, the yin principle, it's Isis, Mercury, that's Thoth, how you think, how you perceive reality. Mars, the warrior, that's Sat, the masculine or yang principle, all in Capricorn. That's a lot. If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. That's really true for you when it comes to the sign Capricorn. So in traditional astrology, okay, Earth, it's a practical sign. It's about structure. It's like liking to create structures, really enjoying that, and really good at it. If you have to pack a car, call a Capricorn. They're very good at it. But it's, if we bring in the Egyptian archetype, we've got Khnum. Okay, so Khnum is a creator god who created the humans and the animals who live on Earth. And he did that by putting them on his potter's wheel. So he created them. But what's really important about him is that's not his only job. Whenever we go through a process of transformation and change, he brings us back in and puts us back on the wheel and gives us a spin. And he rearranges our Ka body, which is our energetic form, to better accommodate this transformation that we're going through. Okay. So this can be quite literally, you break your arm and suddenly you can't, do the things you did before. You got to do it differently. Khnum's like, get back on the wheel and spin you. We got to adjust to the fact that you now have a broken arm. Got to give it time to heal. right? We could think of Khnum as one of your strands of gold, right? And he's really strong for you. So the way I would interpret that is not only are you going to go through many, many, many iterations of yourself, you're constantly opening up to new things coming through. And the more you're kind of willing on some level to, like, Khnum, think I need to get back on your wheel, spin me, you know. Yeah, just imagine being spun on a wheel for a moment. Okay. Just think about that. It's very discombobulating, right? Kids, when I was a kid, it's loved the what do you call them? Those twisty things go round and round. What do they call it? Little merry-go-rounds and
Yeah.
playgrounds. They're crazy,
Roundabout.
it's roundabout that throw you off, whatever. More than one broken arm came from those experiences. But kids like to be dizzy, right? And then you're kind of like, oh my goodness, right? Because on some level it feels like you're dizzy and then you come back, but it's different, right? That's one of the strands of your DNA. Not only are you meant to do that a lot, that's a place that you hold for others. That's part of who you are. You've gone through your Saturn return now. You're moving into your maturity.
Yeah.
It's time to be who you came here to be. And this is part of what you hold for others, is an invitation to get on the wheel. Let yourself be discombobulated. Let your sense of reality be shaken up. In traditional astrology, everything has its shadow, of course. In life, everything has its shadow. The shadow side of Capricorn is to hang on to structure, to grip it long after it needs to change. It's Capricorn is about structure of society, structure of government. If we have a government that's not willing to change, we have authoritarianism. We have the patriarchy, right? What Khnum is doing is he's changing form to accommodate changes in substance. So continually creating new forms for yourself and holding the giving form to new structures for others. However that ends up, whether, is through podcasts like this and it takes off and you become a person who brings people on, who present ideas that could discombobulate people, you're holding a form, right? It's like, it's okay. Just go with it, right? It's all right. You'll get off the wheel and be open then to what comes in, a new way of doing things. Now, I think, this is just me, I think we receive guidance all the time, and there's a huge internal struggle that goes on between how we think things ought to be, which is frequently based on fear. If we let go of how we think things ought to be, it feels like we're going to free fall. We're going to die. Oops, that's not good. Right. Or there's being willing to be discombobulated so we can allow ourselves to be reformed. Can I just say something about Pluto and Osiris here for a sec?
I would love you to.
Because in Greek and Roman astrology and in myth and in traditional astrology, Pluto is a fearsome character, right? He is the lord of the underworld. He is the god of death. And in traditional old-time astrology, there's no rebirth attached to that. The Greeks believed Pluto's realm, he was Hades to them. That was his realm, Hades. Sounds like hell to me. The shades would wander forever. You would die, you would go into Pluto's realm, you would never get out. There was no regeneration, there was no rebirth. You would wander as a shade for eternity. Now, later in Greek history, they invented the Elysium Fields, so heroes like Achilles could go there and live like in a version of heaven. That's not where the common people went. And that was not the antecedent. The antecedent was this place that was a true underworld where you would wander as a shade for eternity. Now that's scary as hell.
Yeah.
Right? And we cannot forget that Greek civilization has everything to do, their philosophical perspective, with the modern Western perspective on things. That's our antecedent. Okay. If you go back to Osiris, he was a god who was killed and died. His consort, the feminine, Isis, and her sister, Nephthys, the dark one, found him, remembered him. In that process of remembering, Isis brings him, has sexual union with him, and a child is born. He is the essence of the new life that comes out of death. A progression historically is from that idea, Osiris, for every death there is a rebirth, to Pluto. You're going to go into Hades and never get out. I think we want to reclaim Osiris, right? Because in the truth, I mean, I think everyone can identify with this, is that in any given lifetime, there will be many, many deaths, not only literal deaths, death of people you love, death of a relationship, death of a pet, death of a place, death of a job. Sometimes you kill it yourself. This was a great job. I loved it, but I'm not learning anything anymore. I'm bored. I need to get out of here. I need to leave. And sometimes people go, oh, what are you leaving? You'll lose your benefits. It's a great job. No, I need to leave. So we need to listen to those urges that are urging us towards wholeness. That's the way I think that's why the Netters come to us, the Neteru come to us through dreams and visions, is to urge us on to wholeness. To remember that it's not black and white, to move out of polarization into wholeness. We have all kinds of ways we talk about this. Everything comes to an end. Something new will come out of this, but we don't embody it. They're disembodied ideas that need to be brought in, and we need to live from that place. Yeah. That's the blueprint for me.
I love what you said there. Reclaim Osiris.
Yes.
That sounds
He
true.
lives within us. That's, so, oh yes, I have to leave this. There's something waiting for me. I know it. And the saddest thing is the people who don't leave. Who stay stuck. That's Saturn. That's Sobek, the old king. They don't change. They stay stuck. It's a recipe. I'm sure you know some people like this. Most people do, for bitterness and depression.
Yeah.
Right. And sadness. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruby. That was honestly so interesting. I kind of took so many notes and I had like a million tangents of thoughts there that go off, but I'm conscious of your time and also it's 10:30 p.m. here.
Yes, getting
So
late for you.
it's getting really late. But I just want to say thank you so much because that was beyond interesting and offered me so many different connection points and also nuances in perspective as well.
Well, thank you. It's fun to talk about it. And there's a lot for me. I mean, this is my world, so it's fun.
Well, I feel it's so cool because this is a bit of a nerdy thing, but I feel like you, Zara definitely as well, Nikki and Normandy, without knowing you, you shaped so much of what I moved through over the past 6 years. Um, and yeah, it was I experienced a lot of challenging things. And I think that if the Neteru, well, I feel so lucky that the Neteru did come into my life and guide me through that internally. But the external points that I had to help me understand what I was moving through, your work was a huge part of that. So it feels really cool to be able to have these conversations with you as well. And um, yeah, just listen to some more of your ideas on it all because it's so interesting.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to share. And thank you for being one of the ones who's listening, not to me, but to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ruby. I'm gonna stop recording now, but thank you very much.